Let's decode the beginning of feminist thought, the first wave, active during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Its core focus? Women's suffrage and legal rights. This was the era when women fought for their voice in politics and public life. Asked in exam. Even though literary feminism hadn't formally begun, we now look back at characters like Chaucer's Wife of Bath as early signs of resistance to gender roles, proto-feminist voices hidden in plain sight. At the center of this wave stood Mary Wollstonecraft, who published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. She argued for women's moral and intellectual equality, building on Enlightenment ideas. Her earlier work, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, laid the groundwork. Fast forward to 1929, and we meet Virginia Woolf with A Room of One's Own. Woolf claimed that for a woman to write, she must have both money and a room of her own. Simple, powerful, unforgettable. Asked in exam. Together, Wollstonecraft and Woolf formed the philosophical and literary foundation of first-wave feminism. Political rights may have been the goal, but their words sparked a revolution in how we read, write, and imagine gender. Let's talk about one of the most radical voices of the Victorian era, John Stuart Mill, a philosopher who dared to imagine a society where women were not bound by tradition but liberated by reason. Born in 1806 and living through the heart of the 19th century, Mill was not just a political thinker, he was a feminist long before it was fashionable or even acceptable to be one. His groundbreaking work, The Subjection of Women, was published in 1869, a time when the very idea of women voting or owning property was dismissed by most as absurd. But Mill, writing in collaboration with his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, boldly challenged these norms. Their earlier partnership on Liberty in 1859 had already laid the groundwork for questioning authority and defending individual rights. After Harriet's death, Mill carried forward the flame and directed it toward the entrenched inequalities between men and women. His central thesis is this: gender inequality is not natural, it is manufactured, it is the result of custom, law, and societal conditioning. Mill declared, "The anxiety of mankind to intervene on behalf of nature is an altogether unnecessary solicitude. What women by nature cannot do, it is quite superfluous to forbid them from doing." Can you feel the weight of that? He's not just making a moral appeal, he's using logic to dismantle patriarchal myths. Pause here and note this down. Mill was one of the first to argue that we cannot know the true nature of gender differences because society has never allowed women the freedom to discover who they really are. He writes, "I deny that anyone knows or can know the nature of the two sexes as long as they have only been seen in their present relation to one another." And surprisingly, it was asked in exam. Mill goes even further. He compares the legal status of women in marriage to slavery, not metaphorically, directly. He asserts, wives are in general no better treated than slaves, and the wife is the actual bondservant of her husband. These words shook Victorian society, and they should still shake us today, especially in your UGC NET exam. It was asked, really? According to Mill, the traditional marriage structure with the husband as master and the wife as dependent was not a loving partnership but a legal trap. He writes, the husband was called the lord of the wife and proposes that marriage should become a voluntary civil contract free from economic coercion and restrictive inheritance laws. This was nothing short of revolutionary, and this was also asked in your recent exam. Can you recall how many times we've heard the excuse that women are naturally suited for domestic life? Mill dismissed that idea without hesitation. He offered historical evidence to prove that, given the opportunity, women could excel. He pointed to figures like Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, and Joan of Arc, real women, not myths who led with intellect, courage, and strength. As a member of parliament and the president of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, he actively pushed for policy changes. When he wrote, "Under whatever conditions and within whatever limits men are admitted to the suffrage, there is not a shadow of justification for not admitting women under the same It wasn't a rhetorical flourish, it was a direct call for women's right to vote. Again, asked in exam, let's step into the world of a woman who lit the very first torch for modern feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft. Born in 1759, she was more than just a writer. She was a radical thinker, an educator, and a woman who challenged the very foundation of patriarchal society at a time when women were expected to remain silent. Her journey began in education. Working as a teacher and governess, Wollstonecraft witnessed firsthand how limited the world was for women. This experience gave rise to her first major work, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, published in 1787. Just 1 year later, she released Mary, a Fiction, a semi-autobiographical novel exploring the vulnerability, strength, and resilience of women in a rigid society. But pause here and mark this. It was in the year 1792 that she published the text that would make history, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which strictures on political and moral subjects is still considered one of the most powerful and enduring treatises in feminist philosophy. In it, Wollstonecraft argues clearly and courageously that women are not naturally inferior to men. They only appear so because they have been denied access to education. That's true and also asked in exam. She writes, "It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity. And the foundation of this dignity, she insists, must be reason and justice." Rejecting the idea that rights should be based on tradition or inheritance, she declared that rights must be founded upon reason and justice, accessible to all human beings regardless of gender. Let's rewind just a bit. Before she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she published A Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790. This was a direct response to Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, in which he defended tradition and social hierarchy. Wollstonecraft replied with sharp logic and bold defiance, laying the groundwork for a feminist revolution grounded in Enlightenment values. Wollstonecraft did not just want equality for its own sake, she saw women as essential to the moral and intellectual progress of society. She believed they were not just mothers and wives, but potential philosophers, writers, and leaders. If girls were given the same opportunities as boys, she argued, they would become not only more capable wives and mothers, but also independent, intellectually engaged members of society. Her personal life was filled with intensity, both emotionally and intellectually. After the birth of her first daughter, Fanny, in 1794, and a painful breakup with Gilbert Imlay, Wollstonecraft attempted suicide. But she survived and returned to London to join a vibrant intellectual circle. Imagine this, she was engaging in ideas with people like William Godwin, Thomas Holcroft, William Blake, Thomas Paine, and even William Wordsworth. Her relationship with Godwin blossomed into marriage in 1797, but tragedy struck soon after. 11 days after giving birth to their daughter, Mary Shelley, the future author of Frankenstein, Wollstonecraft, died of complications. Yet her voice was far from silenced. One of her most profound later works was Letters Written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, published in 1796. It's part travelogue, part philosophical reflection, a glimpse into the emotional and intellectual depth of her thinking. And even posthumously, her ideas lived on. Her unfinished novel, Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, published in 1798, serves as a fictional continuation of A Vindication, portraying the institutional oppression women faced and their struggle for freedom. Pause here and reflect. Wollstonecraft's writings weren't just for her time. They laid the foundation for all feminist thought that followed. Her insistence on rational education, equal rights, and intellectual dignity continues to shape the way we read, write, and fight for justice. She remains, even today, a luminous figure in the history of feminist criticism and Enlightenment era radical thought. Let's talk about now one of the most powerful voices in feminist literary history, Virginia Woolf, and her trailblazing essay, A Room of One's Own, published in 1929. This work didn't just make an argument, it lit a fire that still burns at the heart of feminist criticism today. The essay grew out of two lectures Woolf delivered in 1928 at Newnham College and Girton College, two pioneering institutions for women at Cambridge University. And here's where it all begins with a single, unforgettable line. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Simple, right? But behind those few words lies a revolutionary demand for economic and spatial autonomy, a direct challenge to the patriarchal structures that had, for centuries, kept women intellectually and creatively dependent. Woolf laments that women, unlike men, are rarely granted the peace, time, or private space to think and create. In her era, they were expected to serve, to host, to care, but not to write. And so she constructs a bold metaphor, a fictional figure named Judith Shakespeare, the imagined sister of William Shakespeare, just as brilliant, just as passionate, but utterly doomed. Denied education, manipulated by society, and ultimately silenced, Judith dies forgotten. She never had a room of her own. She never had the chance to write her plays. Now here's the golden trick. Woolf isn't just giving us facts. She's crafting allegory, persona, and symbolism. At one point, she introduces herself as one of the four Marys, saying, "Here then was I call me Mary Beton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or by any name you please, it is not a matter of any importance." These names echo both historical attendants of Mary, Queen of Scots, and characters from a 16th century Scottish ballad. Through them, Woolf invokes forgotten women, those who lived in silence, in service, or under punishment. Woolf also turns her attention to literary history. She celebrates foremothers like Aphra Behn, Jane Austen, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters, while simultaneously critiquing the ways male critics such as Desmond McCarthy, disguised in the essay as Z, dismiss women writers like Rebecca West as arrant feminists. Her sarcasm is sharp, but her insight even sharper. Can you recall this line? It's a classic UGC NET reference. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She's all but absent from history. That contradiction hits hard. Women in literature are queens, goddesses, muses, but in real life? In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. This was asked in exam. Pause here and note this. Woolf is drawing a powerful contrast between fictional idealization and social disempowerment. Women are everywhere in art, but invisible in power. This becomes a foundational idea in feminist literary criticism, to question how gender roles are romanticized in texts while being repressed in reality. And then comes Woolf's vision of the future. In her final passages, she introduces the idea of the androgynous mind, a creative ideal that blends both masculine and feminine energies. She doesn't want women to merely imitate male traditions. She urges them to write their own stories, produce their own criticism, and reclaim their rightful place in history. Her influence? Tremendous. Think of Alice Walker, who responded with In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, highlighting how race and class add further barriers to that so-called room. And yet, Woolf's demand still resonates: space, education, and the freedom to create. Virginia Woolf, with clarity, grace, and fire, gifted us not just a feminist essay, but a blueprint for transformation. She asked, "What does a woman need to write?" and answered, "Just enough room to be free." Now, let's have a look at one of the most powerful literary writings in feminist and post-colonial literature, Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, published in 1966. This novel reimagines Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre from the voice of the forgotten woman Bertha Mason, the so-called Madwoman in the attic. You get this question all the time in the exam. But here, she is no longer a symbol, she becomes a subject. Rhys gives her a name, Antoinette Causeway, a white Creole woman in the Caribbean. Her descent into madness is not inevitable, it's imposed by colonial displacement, racial alienation, and patriarchal control. The madness isn't in her mind, it's in the world that refuses to accept her identity. Through Antoinette, Rhys exposes how women, especially colonized women, are silenced, fragmented, and erased from their own narratives. Pause here and recall why Sargassoti is both feminist and post-colonial. It critiques the patriarchal construction of female madness and interrogates how colonialism shapes identity. As Gilbert and Gubar argued, literature often reduces women to binaries, angel or monster. Rhys breaks that binary wide open. Antoinette is neither. She is a woman shattered by history, longing for belonging, caught in a world that calls her other. Rhys's novel is a literary palimpsest, a rewriting of canonical literature from the margins. It demands that we listen to suppressed voices and see madness not as a flaw but as a cry for recognition. White Sargassoti is more than a prequel, it's a reclamation. It insists that feminist and post-colonial readings must walk hand in hand to uncover plural histories and silence truths.